But today, the big question is the European neighborhood policy's role in promoting social transformation amongst the countries of Europe's periphery, and if it has been a success or a failure. I would probably add another question that needs to be answered to this, and that question is, what role, or should the ENP have a role in promoting social transformation along this periphery to begin with? But first, it's worth recapping on the early days of the ENP. A bit of the history of the ENP was already touched on. In sum, the two main goals were, one, to create a zone of stability and security around Europe's periphery, and secondly, to promote European values and ideas and norms and democracy and all this to Europe's periphery. And doing both of those while engaging with Europe's neighbors. Judged against these two goals, I would say it probably hasn't been very successful. The example of Belarus was already given. It's made very little progress since the inception of the ENP. You could argue that the Ukraine was actually reversed since Europe started engaging through the ENP. And let's not forget that the Eastern Partnership, of course, is the mechanism used inside the ENP to engage with Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, but also the ENP encompasses North Africa and the near abroad. And I think we saw with the popular uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa last year, again, this presented challenges to the ENP. And in fact, you could argue that the events in North Africa, and Egypt and Libya in particular, created a dilemma for the two original goals of the ENP. And I'll say this in very simple terms. It's not as black and white as I'm about to say, but very simple terms. If you wanted to promote stability and security, you would have backed the regimes that were already in place to stay in power. If you wanted to promote democracy, then you would have supported the popular uprisings to overthrow these regimes. So again, those two aren't very compatible in North Africa. But I think maybe we were hoping for too much from the ENP. And this is where I'd like to answer my second question. What role should the ENP have in promoting social transformation? And this leads me to my main argument, that social transformation, it's a process, not an event. No matter where we are in the world, we can be in the United States, we can be across Europe, we can be in North Africa, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Central Asia, it doesn't matter. We're not going to wake up one day and realize that we have a perfect society. And these things take time, this sort of transformation takes time. And I think that if you go to the European Union's website that focuses on the ENP and you read some of the language there, I think sometimes it can be as if the European Union is sort of forcing its views, its ideas on its neighbors. And this is, if you want to be as good as us Europeans, this is what you need to do. And I think that it's worth for, and this is the case for U.S. foreign policy, largely speaking, as well. And I think that the U.S. and Europe should look back at a bit of its own history to see that it's not so simple. I like to remind from the date of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, when that book was published, to the end of slavery in the UK was 50 years. From the end of slavery in the United States, from the U.S. Civil War to the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, that was 100 years. And believe it or not, it's hard to believe now that just 50 years ago, there were places in America where a white man cannot marry a black woman, or where states actually mandated segregated public education. So we're all continuing, we are all transforming. And so I think when we look back at our own history, we should realize that each country is different. Has a different set of circumstances, history, culture, and these things take time. And when you look at all this and you think, well, gosh, the ENP hasn't done very much, well, it hasn't been around very long. When we're talking about centuries, when we're talking about generations, when we're talking about 50 years, 100 years, it hasn't had that much of an opportunity. And this brings me also to the whole so-called Arab Spring issue and the ENP. I think that whoever decided to coin the term Arab Spring really proved to the world that the West largely misunderstood what was happening in North Africa and the Middle East. If I could go back and if I had the power to do it, I would rename it the Arab generation. Because the social transformation that's taking place in North Africa and the Middle East as a result of young North Africans and young Arabs having access to the internet, satellite television, social media, Facebook, Twitter, seeing that there is an alternative to their authoritarian regimes, this is the generation that's going to bring the change. And it's going to take a generation. It's not going to take 3 months, the season of spring in 2011. It's ridiculous. And this idea of a generational change reminds me of what's inscribed on the Ronald Reagan statue here in Tbilisi. And if you haven't been there yet, it's in a beautiful park, and it's a beautiful statue. And inscribed on the statue, it says, "Freedom is never more than a generation away from extinction." And it requires the generational change to hand out to the next generation to promote this type of social transformation. So what does the EU need to do? Well, the European Union needs to continue keeping the idea of Europe alive. With or without the ENP, with or without the European Union, the values and ideas that Europeans stand for will be a magnet to other people. You don't need these institutions to be a magnet, to draw your neighbors and to want to be part of a club. But we need to realize that it's not just on the European Union level as well. It needs to also be done on a bilateral level. In the 21st century, when we discuss the European Union, sometimes we tend to forget that the nation state still matters, that the nation state does exist. And alongside cooperation and engagement from the European Union with its neighbors, we need stronger bilateral Germany, France, the UK, all the individual European countries working bilaterally with Europe's neighbors as well. I think that will go a long way. Romano Prodi, when he said those comments early on, he also said that the ENP will offer everything but institutions. And I think for a country like Georgia, that's just selling Georgia short. And that, like I said, Georgia's future is in Europe. It's worked hard so far to be part of the European Union. It's worked hard so far to someday be part of these institutions. And it's simply not a matter of the lazy way of engaging with your neighbors without keeping the door open. And we saw this with Turkey, who's been continuously promised membership of the European Union, but it's continuously vetoed by unnamed European countries. And we see that Georgia is a leader in this region, in the Caucasus, at social transformation. And in conclusion, I would simply say that it's going to be a long path for Georgia to become a full member of the European Union. It's going to be a long path for Georgia to become a member of NATO. It's going to happen. I just ask that you're patient, because when you get there, it's going to be worth it. And the European Union and NATO needs to realize that Georgia's future is in these two organizations. So, while I think the ENP has had noble objectives, I think it's probably been given an impossible task if it's meant to socially transform this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to say I don't necessarily agree totally with you about this. You know, the ENP hasn't been around long enough to really make a judgment on it, and it's been around for almost a decade. But I do agree that probably now this region is more insecure and unstable than it actually was at the point when the policy was actually first out and about. I mean, none of the frozen conflicts have been resolved. In some cases, they've actually deteriorated. We've got a worse situation now in Ukraine, a worse situation in Belarus, which is all very concerning. And really, you have to ask the question, maybe this policy needs to be, rejigged or a new strategy put into it once again. And you also have other players in the region. I mean, we're still talking about Russia. I mean, of course, out of their way to want to have increased ties with Russia, but sometimes they're put in a position where they have to. And also you now have Turkey that is playing an increased role in this neighbourhood, which is also a fact that we have to consider. So now I'm going to give the floor to Wayne David, MP from the UK, please.
Well, thanks very much indeed. And could I say it's a pleasure to be here. It's the second time I've come to Georgia, and I've got to say the advances in 12 short months are quite noticeable. The purpose of our discussion this evening is to look at the European neighbourhood policy as it particularly applies to Caucasus and Georgia. And I think that the ENP is extremely ambitious. It is a set of plans of action points to enhance and develop prosperity and democracy. Those are two of the key objectives there. And I'd like to suggest this evening that if the ENP is going to be achieved, and if it's going to be used as a base on which to build, it's very important that one essential concept is firmly in place. And that's the concept of decentralization and the devolution of power. Now, I'm from the United Kingdom, and one of the lessons which the Labour government in 13 years learned was that decentralization works. Britain traditionally has been a very centralized unitary state. There was the Act of Union between England and Wales way back in 1536. Then there was the Act of Union between Scotland and England in 1707. Then there was unity with Ireland. But until quite recent times, the United Kingdom has been very much focused on London and the institutions of the British state. And I think one of the great ironies when we talk about Europe is that after the Second World War, where Britain and its civil servants took a lead in transforming Germany and creating a new structure of government, actually warmly embraced and effectively implemented a concept which they rejected in the United Kingdom, and that is devolution and decentralization. Germany today is one of the most decentralized countries inside the European Union. We look at its banking structure, for example, very decentralized in comparison to other countries. We look at the lender structure of government, very effective in producing a culture of enterprise. And I would argue that one of the reasons why Germany today is so successful, especially in comparison to as many of its European neighbours, is because it's embraced this concept. Or to be more accurate, it's had the British had to impose upon it a concept of devolution and decentralization post-1945. That's one of the great ironies, I think, of modern history. But in the United Kingdom, during the 1990s, there was a concerted effort to decentralize power away from the centre. We saw, for example, the Scottish Parliament being established or re-established in 1997. We saw devolution in Northern Ireland with a democratically elected assembly there. We saw the capital city of London being given an assembly, which has proved to be very successful. And also in my own country of Wales, we saw a National Assembly being established, really, for the first time. And that was in 1997. A referendum of the people of Wales took place, and although the population of Wales is just under 3 million, an assembly was established on a majority of only 6,600 votes. So it's a very, very close vote. And many people at the time questioned, because there's this general lack of enthusiasm, whether or not the Welsh Assembly would prove to be successful, whether it would last for any time whatsoever.